Joni Mitchell. I saw a picture of her the other day. She's still touring.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yes, she's a bit older, but... All right, so welcome. I have a bigger podium because I have more stuff. But thank you for coming. So today what we're going to do is we're going to, you're like, oh my God, not more stuff. We are going to finish talking about our series on science and spirituality, or science and God, because it's an issue where there sometimes has been a schism that does not need to be. So what I wanted to do today, the talk today is titled Science and Spirituality, What Do You Think? So I wanted to have a discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about Einstein and God, but then I also want to have a discussion and see what you think. Because my take has always been that the wisdom is in the room, and even more importantly, the experience is in the room, because everybody has different experiences in terms of growing up and in terms of how they view it now, to see the confluence and the connection between what many sometimes think is an irreparable divide, science and spirituality. And what I have done for today is I continue doing some research in this book, which I highly recommend. This is a plug for a book by Krista Tippett. How many folks have heard of Krista Tippett? I'm sure lots have. Excellent. Krista Tippett is a journalist. She is a master of divinity. She has published many books, and what she did is she went and spoke. This is called Einstein's God, Conversations about Science and the Human Spirit. It is riveting. It really is. What she did is she went and she spoke to a lot of different scientists, physicists, biologists, chemists, theoretical physicists, folks who knew about quarks, and she talked to them about what their work and their evolving understanding of the mysteries of the universe and how their scientific inquiry informed that. And they come from traditions of Christianity, they came from traditions of Hinduism and Judaism. I swear, it is a fascinating book, and I really recommend it to you. So one of the thinkers and teachers of the last century who really, more so than we know, informed the question of science and spirituality was Einstein. And if you read some of his later in life writings, he really became, I want to say, more spiritual, and that's maybe putting a patina on it that I don't want. He became more understanding of the fact that there's a mystery, and there's an intelligence and a mind behind the mystery. And we may not know it all, but that's okay. He wrote, "Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble." When I read these scientists, or I read about these scientists, the feeling I come away with is a feeling that they ascribed to Darwin, which was reverence. Reverence and wonder and awe at the investigations these men and women were making into what many saw as the mind of God. What an amazing thing. Einstein said, "I want to know how God created this world. I am not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are details." Isn't that something? I want to know his thoughts. Einstein, he ascribed, in one of his later writings, he ascribed his genius and his ability to comprehend intuitively things that just come in those aha moments to his the fact that he was a late bloomer. I did not know this. Einstein was a late bloomer. He remained enthralled throughout childhood as to why things work. And one of the first things that triggered him in that, all you parents take note, is his father gave him a compass when he was about 4. And what he did is he looked at this compass, and it just blew his mind, because he realized that it moved in ways that he did not control. Because up until that time, if you wanted something to move, you had to push it, or you had to blow it, or you had to draw, you had to do something. And this thing was just moving on its own. And he just became gripped with this wonder as to what was making this happen. What were the forces that were making this happen? He became mesmerized by gravity and light, and he saw the connection with time. And he spent his life, as he put it, seeking to comprehend the order deeply hidden behind everything. and to describe it mathematically. Just think about that. He often spoke of this as his longing to understand what God was thinking. I think that's just a beautiful notion. He did not believe in a personal God. He did not believe in a God that would make Alabama win or lose or whatever happened yesterday. And I actually watched the end of it. Auburn won, yes, okay. He did not believe in a God that engineered that result. He believed in a God that just poured its energy into creation. And in that way, not only created a universe that began wonderfully, but created a universe which is constantly creating and making itself. There is a physicist and a theologian named John Polkinghorne, who's in this book. He's wrote some fascinating stuff. He believed in a God who created something more beautiful than a ready-made world. You know how the theists thought, all our founding fathers who were theists, they thought that God created this wonderful mechanistic structure and just, hit the go button and step back? That is a mechanical concept, which so many of these thinkers have gone beyond. Polkington believed in a God who created something more beautiful than a ready-made world. He created a world with an inborn capacity to become and create itself. Creation has an inborn capacity to continue creating itself. So what does that mean? It means that it can be chaotic. It means that, like we've talked about in the past, there is good and there is not so good. There is life, there is death. There are both ends of this spectrum. And this week, these past couple weeks, have just taught me so much about that, because if I believe that it's all God, as I do, that it is a creation constantly creating, then the sadness and the lessons and the loss and the gains have all come out of this experience, and it's all from the same source. As we all go back to the same source, as we all come from the same source. That song, We Are Stardust, that's what these scientists say. We are all made of the dust of stars, billions of years old. What a mind-blowing thing. When you get up in the morning, do you look in the mirror and think that? Probably not, but that's who we are. That is the gift of a generative view of science and spirituality. Richard Rohr, who's one of my favorite authors, he's a Catholic father, he wrote, God loves things by becoming them. God loves things by becoming them, by pouring her divine energy into ongoing creation. And what's so wonderful about science today is that the more we find out, the more we understand how this wonderful creation works, and the less we are inclined to follow what is called the God in the gaps theory. Has anybody ever heard of that, God in the gaps? The way that works, and it's a dual way of looking at things, is that science can tell us some things, and the things we didn't understand, it was just God. We couldn't understand it. We just couldn't figure it out. It was God in the gaps. The problem is that the more we understand, the less room there is for God, right? Because the gaps are getting smaller. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote, there's a passage in one of his letters and papers from prisons. He wrote that if God is consigned to the unknowable and we are learning more and more, then God is always being pushed further and further out of human experience because there are fewer gaps. So what do we do when we're just done with the God in the gaps theory? We can step back and take the balcony view and we can say it's all God. Switch the paradigm. God created a universe, in whatever you call God, I just use that word, whatever you call that energy, created a universe which is constantly becoming and constantly creating and constantly dying and generating. If you look, some of these scientists wrote this great image. If you look in a cell and you look at all the activity in that cell in a micro fashion, it is so loud and chaotic that you would just not be able to even live in it. Imagine being in the middle of lights going off and noise and bangs and chaos and movement. But yet when you look at it, what you realize is there is an order in that movement. that cell is moving in a way to survive, to adapt, to live, to create new life. And so what this generative theory of science and spirituality for me does is it takes what one might think of the chaos of the universe and turns it into a generation toward life, and a generation toward adaptation, and a generation toward growth. Charles Darwin, when he was initially going to go into the church, he had a career set out for him in the church. I guess back then your parents could do that if you were going to the church. But anyway, he went and took a 5-year voyage. My parents did not do that, by the way. He went and took a 5-year voyage on the Beagle. And he wrote notes on the Beagle, and he traveled all over the world. He went down to the Galapagos. He went everywhere. He saw amazing things he had never seen before. And what he came away with is he came away with a notion of what he called the tree of life, which is an image from Genesis, because that's the time in which he grew up, and that's the images that came to him. But it's a web, it's what we might call the web of life. It's a web of connectivity and connection and interdependence, and what Thich Nhat Hanh just called interbeing. And that was his theory, what we now call evolution, what he first called transmutation. And it took him 20 years to release The Origin of the Species, because he knew it was going to raise a lot of eyebrows. Okay, that's another way of saying it was going to piss a lot of people off, which it did. But what I also found out is in 1886 or 1887, there was a guy who traveled around the United States who basically talked about Darwin's theories, and everybody was really thrilled. Nobody put the guy in jail or threw him out of town. And then by the time we got to 1925, things had kind of changed, but that was due to cultural influences in the United States. But initially, there was a lot of receptivity to this theory and a lot of welcoming of the notion that this is the way the divine worked. So now, what I want to do is I want to start moving into just some of your thoughts on this, because I want to know how this issue impacts you, if it does. Now, let me just start off. I am very lucky because when I grew up, my sister and I grew up Episcopalian, which means that I really, and maybe I was just totally clueless, but I walked away with no preconceptions of creation. I don't think I learned much. But the good news was, there was no judgment. They didn't talk about hell. You just went to church, and then afterwards, you had a glass of wine, and that was good. But that was just back then. But it was good for me because I did not walk away with a whole lot of judgment about how God functions in the world and what I was allowed to think and what I wasn't allowed to think. And I know there's been a lot of harm generated by people who have walked out of institutions with a lot of judgment and preconceived notions that conflict with their view of how the universe works. But what I have learned from reading this book and other resources I've looked at is that our image of God must be consistent with the way we experience life. Because if not, we can't draw from it and we can't grow with it. It has to harmonize with our personal experience. It has to inform our personal experience. And as I was reading about these different scientists and what they found and what they thought, that is what they came to believe, is that sometimes there are questions which science answers, and there are questions that spirituality answers. And sometimes when we get sideways, we expect them both to answer the same question, and sometimes they don't. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? If anybody has a thought, just shout it out. But this is just me talking up here. And one of the examples I give to that is if I look at a beautiful painting, and I'm a scientist, or I'm a chemist, I can look at that painting and I can give you amazing detail on how it's painted, on the pigment, on the brush strokes, on how old it is, all the physical stuff about that painting. But at the same time, as somebody who is just appreciating it, I get a very different view. I look at that painting and I don't care about all that stuff. It just speaks to me and gives me an emotional energy that I take away from that piece of art. There's one author in this book, his name is V.V. Raman. And what he talks about is, he's a physicist and he's an emeritus professor of physics and humanities at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And what he has come away with in his work, after years of teaching physics and then later in life, delving more into spirituality, is he has focused on poetry. And he writes some beautiful things about poetry. He says, poetry is the way the human soul understands spirituality. Because it's evocative and it's beautiful. He wrote a line from Rabindranath Tagore, who influenced Gandhi greatly and is a favorite of this poet. He wrote, this is what Tagore wrote. He wrote, "Oh, grant me the prayer that I may never lose the bliss of the touch of the one in the play of the many." I may never lose the touch of the one in the play of the many. What does that mean? It means that I may always know that we are one, and the way I appreciate that is by seeing the diversity of life. That's what Darwin saw when he saw the diversity of species and the adaptation and the micro changes that species make over time to adapt and to live and to follow that generative impulse toward life. This guy Dr. Rahman wrote, "It is in the words of the poets that the deepest religious feelings of humankind survive." Isn't that beautiful? So what has been some of your experience with some of these issues? Hey, Judy.
I believe that everything that is always has been. And as science evolves, our study of science, with discoveries and innovations and knowledge, it's just going back to prove that it all has an order to it. Beyond what science or a scientist could come up with, there's an order to it all. And that's just very reassuring to me to think that there is just this wonderful plan out there, and I'm an itty teeny tiny part of it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, that's one of the historians of religion teach us that one of the basic reasons for the development of religious theologies is to give us a sense that there is order in chaos. Because we need that. We just need to understand that there is something out there that makes sense, even if we can't understand what it is. And you know what interested me about some of these discussions? There were some of these scientists, and one of them is a guy named Sherwin Newland, who I thought he was a surgeon and a teacher of bioethics. And what he wrote was that the human drive toward transcendence, the human drive toward higher consciousness, is wired into us. It's a biological imperative. So that was an interesting question for me. Is it a biological imperative, or is it just another way of looking at different questions? What he said is, when he examined the neural pathways in our brain, the way our brains think, when an item of information or when a data point or whatever physically it is hits our brains, there are billions of neural pathways that are options for that trigger to take. Billions. And so what our brain does is it processes that impulse in a way that leads toward health. And over the generations, we have learned to realize what draws us toward health, what draws us toward growth. And that is an impulse toward compassion and connection and spirituality and joy and love. So he looks at the way we have evolved, the way humans specifically have evolved, and he says that is part of our neural wiring, because over generations we have chosen beauty, is the way he puts it. We have chosen to see things that are beautiful, and it has benefited us over time, as opposed to choose to see things that are diminishing or things that are fearful. It's in our wiring to do that. I don't know, because I know nothing about biology, I don't know if that's true, but it's an interesting way that a scientist goes ahead and puts together what he has studied with what he is looking around. He looks at the world, and the words he uses are wonder and awe. But he thinks his scientific inquiry leads him to that place. that it's a part of God's creation that we are wired that way. He wrote a book called How We Die, and that was part of his insight in that book. But one of the things I came away with as I was reading this is that as these folks learn more about the physical universe, it leads them deeper into an appreciation of creation and into an appreciation of our human connection with each other, with the earth, with all of life. So for me, I've been lucky. There's never been a split between science and spirituality. I know there are people who think the world is 6,000 years old, but I was never had to kind of get past that. You know, the fact that it is such a wondrous ongoing creation proves for me that there is an energy behind it, and an energy behind it that is loving and generative and creative.
So are we just supposed to try to figure out how to analyze that with regard to us? See, for me, there's always been the order versus chaos. Are they different? Are they part of the same journey? Do they intertwine? And a lot of what you've said about these people who are just light years smarter than me is they know more about that interconnection and where it all goes and what it all means. And I don't know, personally, I'm just trying to figure it out. You know, I think what the human brain tries to do, and your neural pathways thing talks about it, is there's so much information we get every day on so many levels. Scientific, spiritual, physical, I mean, everything.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with all of it? You know, how do you, and I'm sorry if this is not even close to what you're talking about, but it's kind of like, what, you know, we're trying to make our own order out of our own chaos and figure out how to navigate it. And for me, being here and being part of this group and the message and the whatever gives me so many ways to attempt to do that. Not always successfully, but at least gives me a framework of some sort to begin the journey. Does that make any sense?
You know, does anybody have a response to that? Tim?
I don't know if it's a response, but where I was going was, I don't know if there is order out of the chaos. Because if I can't make sense of it or understand it, then there's no order. But I'll still keep, I think similar to what you're saying, keep trying to go down that way. I do believe, yes, we are biologically wired to do good, just for the simple fact you know, I believe you're a baby, you're born, you're just that essence of God and good. And as we grow up as humans, we learn to be mean, and learn to be disgusting, and learn to be insulting, and learn to be rude, and all that stuff. But as we go through that, seeking order, I don't even know if I seek order. I agree. Also, you took the words almost right out of my mouth. Was I'm glad these smart people can't figure it out, because
Phew! Yeah.
There's no hope for us.
But that's what I
Yeah.
accept. That's what I'm saying. I accept I can't make sense of it. So that's why it's something bigger.
And that's okay.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's
Yeah,
okay.
I think the where we run into problem both in reason, science, and in faith is when we start to say we've got it all figured out.
Yeah.
That's where we run into problems. Science can have its own bias. I mean, this week they found a new black hole
Yeah.
that they can't explain.
That's huge.
That's huge. So they don't know everything, and they admit they don't know everything. Some religions think they know everything, and that's where they run into trouble, I think. That's why we're here, because we admit we don't
No,
know
I think that's
everything.
that's an
And we're
excellent point.
seeking.
Michael, were you going to say something?
I was. So I don't know if Does everybody know about Schrodinger's box?
Is that the cat?
Yeah. Is it dead or not?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if you don't know, just a quick thing. So Schrodinger is a German guy. He's around Einstein's time. He came up with this thought experiment. If you were to, it's kind of weird, but if you were to put a cat in a box and close the box, you don't know if and put poison in the box with the cat, you don't know if the cat is dead or alive. And so this is how he explains something called quantum superposition, which is there's these little things called quarks, which if we try to look at them, we can't see them, but there's something that live in two states at once. So kind of think it like a 1 or a 0 at the same time, or male and female at the same time, something like that, like some type of dichotomy at the same time. But the problem is when you try and look at it, when you try and observe it, you can only see it in one place at a time, so it looks chaotic. But when you don't look at it, then that's when it's in order. So I think like a big problem we have is we try to look at things too much instead of just letting it be and trying to not observe everything and not explain everything. You can kind of just move on.
Well, it's overthinking, we always are overthinking.
Exactly. We overlook things or not overlook, overthinking is the correct word. We don't have to know everything. It's nice to know everything, you know, through like smart person.
Or it's a curse.
Yeah.
Sometimes not looking is the best thing.
But there may also be different ways of looking at things. I mean, the thing about a quark is you can either know where it is or what it's doing, but you can't know both.
Yeah.
If you know one, you don't know the other. Yeah. And the whole thing about light being a particle or a wave, the way I heard it put is if you ask it a particle question, it'll behave like a particle. If you ask it a wave question, it'll behave like a wave. You know, so it's kind of yes and.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I read, or that folks said as I was experiencing this, is that sometimes we just don't know. I mean, there's a lady in here who's a mathematician, and she said there are certain mathematical truths which cannot be proved by mathematics. There are certain things. So the question is kind of, how do we know?
How do you define that as a truth if you can't prove it?
Because it always
There
works.
you go.
Yeah, but
No, you're right. We have to open, but like you're saying, it's like there's a mystery that we cannot put up on a whiteboard and diagram. Just like you said, but it doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, I can't prove the existence of love. I can't put it on a plate and measure it. But it doesn't mean that it's not a driving force in our lives. Were you going to say something?
well, I was just gonna say, something can be true because it always works. Even if you
Mhm.
can't explain why or prove that it's true, you can only observe that it's true.
Yeah. One of the folks in this book said that we have an addiction to rationality. And one of the things that these scientists are experiencing is that if we want to find a deeper truth, or if we want to continue to explain the truths of the universe as they are unfolding, we have to come to a different way of seeing. Because people believe in quarks, even though you can't put one on a plate and say that's a quark. Yeah, Nicole.
I think there's also something with the order chaos thing as a regenerative cycle, right? So it's like we seek to find order out of chaos, but then when we achieve that level of order, there's another chaos, right? So it's like it's a constant flow, and it's the and thing where it's order and chaos at the same time, but we're only seeing one, then we're seeing another, we're seeing one, we're seeing another.
Yeah.
And it's like that creative process, right? Creation, destruction, life birth, regeneration, right? Because if everything was ordered, we wouldn't seek anything, we'd know it all. And so there's something in the chaos that drives us to seek truth, like maybe gives us purpose in life.
That gives us questions. Why is this happening? What's next? Yeah.
And I think there's something in the order that helps us to go forward.
Yeah, because we're like, then there's like that stasis where we're like,
It's like
okay,
that safe
something has
place
to,
where we can go forward.
Yeah.
and then, exactly, and then to restabilize, and you have to like create disruption again, right? So you know,
Right.
they also say like sometimes, you know, you make plans and God laughs, because you're like, I have it all figured out, and God's like, no, you don't. Right? And like, oh,
Yeah.
man, the next level, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, that's totally true. But I think it's like, you know, it's like what Lori said a while ago, is that when we think we have everything figured out, and this is part of the reason where I believe kind of religion got sideways. Because all of a sudden we had this scientific explosion, and people said instead of the earth being 6,000 years old, it was, you know, billions and billions of years old. And so, you know, folks who were biblical scholars had a choice. They could say, I'm going to read this in a way that lets me understand this new truth, or I'm just going to shut the box and say, no, this is what it says. You know, this is what it says. The last time Sydney and I met to talk about the coming year on the 5th of November. I used to bring her lunch and we used to sit, and in that conversation, I said, Sydney, what is your favorite book of the Bible? And she said it was Genesis, because it just it contains such wonderful creation stories. It contains such wonderful imagery, which when you let it, is not inconsistent with all these wonderful things we're finding out. It's metaphor, it's imagery, it's celebration of what we are uncovering. But what happened is folks got sideways and they said, oh my gosh, all this stuff is threatening our biblical foundation as a Christian nation. So what we're going to do is, well, wham, we have to believe this. And we have to take all this scientific inquiry and we have to not believe it because it contradicts what the Bible says. And that's when folks started getting sideways. But that's not traditionally how scientists have viewed their interaction with religion. I mean, the Galileos, the Copernicuses, the Keplers, all those guys, they just viewed it as a way to understand more how God impacts our world. And to understand more how, as Einstein put it, God thinks. Yes?
I think one of my favorite phrases in almost most situations, if you're kind of stuck, is "and both."
Mm-hmm.
Because it's usually not, even like with politics, it's usually not all of one or all of another that's right. You know, they always say the truth is somewhere in the middle. You know, if you're listening to people, because we all have our own perspective, our own bias, whatever, and that's the observation thing again. I observe it through my lens, you observe it through your lens. So I really like, and Nicole just said that, I really like the "and both" because it allows for dichotomies without having to have an absolute on either side as being the only right solution. And it just makes everything so much easier and more fluid and opens your mind to more possibilities.
Yeah. I think one of the takeaways for me, because I know we're out of time, I think one of the takeaways for me from this series has been not to learn more about science, because I just don't think that's doable, but to be aware of the questions we are asking. Because so many of your answers are driven by your questions. So just to be aware of how we're observing things and be aware of the questions that we are asking. I mean, science is great at answering the question of, you know, why does this boil at 32 degrees? Why does the wind blow? Why? In terms of so much physical stuff. But religion and spirituality really address themselves more to why are we here? How do we live? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And there are places that these disciplines come together and inform each other, certainly.
Science and religion go hand in hand.
Yeah.
It's a principle.
It's a Baha'i principle, you're exactly right. Yeah, and it's a principle of a lot of faith traditions, they absolutely do. And actually, what the Baha'i believe is you can't have one without the other.
That's right.
Yeah, they inform each other, and I forget the phrase, but religion without science is, it's not mythology, but it's empty. And science without religion has no moral compass, is I think the way they put it. So these are interesting questions.
And I love what Sydney has said so many times. This is the way it is, unless of course it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thank you guys. I enjoyed this series. I hope you did.
Very much.